Writers, what if your protagonist's fatal flaw isn't a flaw at all? Writers today have confused moral corruption with depth. And if you're a writer, that confusion can quietly sabotage your characters because you may be trying to fix traits that actually make your hero powerful. We're constantly told that our protagonists need a wound or some fatal flaw that they have to overcome in order to grow. And that's true. Meaningful character arcs always involve confronting something, usually something broken. But here's where writers get into trouble. Not every trait that causes problems in a story is a flaw that needs to be fixed. Take a character like Captain America, for example. What's his flaw? Now, you could argue that it's his integrity. He simply refuses to be corrupted. But his arc is not learn to be less moral. His arc is probably more like, how do you remain moral when the institutions around you fail? And yet, when you have a strong character like this, someone who's principled and has moral clarity, someone will inevitably tell you, well, they're not interesting. What's wrong with them? They need something wrong with them, so they have something to overcome. Because in today's storytelling culture, we've started confusing three different things: character traits versus character wounds versus true character flaws. And when we start to collapse those categories, something strange happens. We start calling conviction being rigid. We start calling courage being reckless. We start calling moral clarity being arrogant. In other words, we start seeing strong moral characteristics in a very negative light, while simultaneously seeing morally compromised characters as being more honest and complex and deep. And that confusion isn't accidental, by the way, it's cultural. We are living in an anti-hero era, and it's quietly distorting the way that writers are building their characters. Hello, and welcome to the Storyteller's Mission with Zena Del Lowe. Today, I want to untangle something extremely important for storytellers, namely the difference between a character trait and a true character flaw. Because if you can't tell the difference, you can't build a meaningful character arc. And more importantly, you may accidentally ruin the very hero that your story needs. So today we're going to explore, where did this idea come from in the first place, the idea of the fatal flaw. We're also going to explore how anti-hero culture is distorting it. And then we're going to explore how to distinguish character traits from real flaws that need to be changed. And then we'll discover how that distinction shapes powerful character arcs. But first, if you enjoy exploring story, culture, and worldview like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel, because that's what we do here. Every week, we look at storytelling not just as craft, but as one of the primary ways culture understands itself. So now let me ask you a question. Think about the protagonist in your story, the one you're currently writing. What do you think their fatal flaw is? What is their weakness? What do they have to overcome? Now hold that answer in your mind as we go, because by the end, you may discover that what you thought was a flaw was never one at all. Okay, so for the past couple decades, culture has been flooded with morally compromised protagonists. Think about characters like Walter White in Breaking Bad, or Tony Soprano in The Sopranos, Don Draper in Mad Men, Dexter in Dexter. These characters are fascinating, but notice something very important. Their flaws are not personality quirks. They're not merely weird things about their personality. These characters are morally corrupt at their core. They are driven by certain things like pride, violence, addiction, self-deception. Walter White's pride is what destroys his family. Don Draper's compulsive deception isolates him from genuine intimacy. Tony Soprano's narcissism poisons every relationship he has. And these are flaws. That much is true, but here's where things get interesting. Over time, audiences began to expect these types of flaws. They began to associate moral corruption with complexity. Now we see corruption as depth. And when someone writes a protagonist who is actually loyal or honest or courageous, morally resolute, someone will inevitably challenge that and say, well, they don't have a flaw, as if virtue itself needs to be corrected. We assume that virtue is boring. Moral conviction suddenly becomes naive. Integrity suddenly needs to be dismantled in order for someone to grow. But these assumptions undermine the very qualities that once defined heroic storytelling. So let me ask you another question. When you think about your protagonist's flaw, ask yourself, is it a moral failure? Or is it simply a defining trait that creates tension in the character's world? Because those two things lead to very different character arcs. That's the confusion I want to untangle. So let's talk about where this idea of the fatal flaw actually came from. The phrase fatal flaw comes from Greek tragedy. Now, in those stories, the hero possesses a moral weakness that ultimately leads to their downfall. Hubris, rage, ambition, blind pride. Think of characters like Oedipus or Achilles. Their flaws are not harmless quirks. They are destructive moral tendencies. And the tragedy emerges because the hero cannot escape the consequences of those flaws. Now, modern storytelling has borrowed this term. But today we have different categories. See, the Greeks dealt primarily with moral failings. Like I said, things like selfishness, pride, cowardice, envy. But there are other types of issues that we still call flaws. So the problem is not that your character has a flaw. Problem for writers is knowing what kind of flaw you're writing, because it might not be the kind that needs to be fixed. Trauma wounds, for example, are where a character deals with unresolved pain from the past, like abandonment or betrayal or loss. Now, in that sort of story, they do need to heal from that so that they can step into the fullness of the person that they were meant to become. Personality quirks, on the other hand, are consistent ways of being, something that your character just is, like being socially awkward or blunt or intense or really stubborn or something like that. These types of traits may include things like moral convictions, someone who is fiercely honest or who refuses to compromise. Take the TV character Bosch, for example. He's obsessive in his pursuit of justice, and it costs him. He's passed over for promotions. He's alienated from his superiors because he will not play ball. He will not compromise. But that's also what makes him noble. So is that a flaw that needs to be fixed? No, it's a moral commitment that exacts a cost. See, we don't want him to grow out of it. We want Bosch to stay true to that. That is what makes him heroic. Now, this is the same thing with traits like honesty and loyalty and emotional sensitivity. They may put someone at risk, right? They might put the character in a risky situation, but that doesn't mean it necessarily needs to be fixed. Even annoying character traits don't automatically qualify as fixable flaws, like vulnerabilities, for example, things like idealism or empathy, or even naivete. Again, those things may put a character at risk, but sometimes that's exactly what makes them charming. For example, Buddy the Elf. He is hopelessly optimistic. He has Christmas spirit. We don't want him to become cynical. We want him to stay exactly the way he is. So all of these types of things represent patterns of behavior that shape a character, but they are not all flaws that need to be corrected. Each of them requires different treatment, so you can't just lump them all together. If you do, it will flatten the character and weaken the arc. But here's the question most writing books never ask. Does the trait that you've given your character cause suffering or harm in a way that demands to be addressed in order for that character to grow? That is actually holding them back, so they need to fix it. But if it's just causing tension, sometimes it's the very thing they need to hold on to, because fixing it would be to lose who they really are at their core. So that is the real acid test. Does it cause harm that must be addressed? Does this trait consistently hold the character back? Or Is it simply something uncomfortable for somebody else? We can't take every critique at face value. So the question isn't, did someone object? It's, is this a pattern that causes real disconnection or harm to that character? And that's the difference between a trait that adds texture and a flaw that shapes the arc. Sometimes people project their discomfort as moral judgment in life and in fiction. I've been told before, you're too intense, or you care too much, or you need to let this go. So just because a trait is unpopular or uncomfortable doesn't mean it's wrong. And sometimes the world is what needs to change, not the character. When that happens, it's not a flaw, it's a point of tension. And it's often what makes the story resonate. So here's a practical exercise for writers. Take your protagonist's supposed flaw and ask yourself, if this trait disappeared tomorrow, would my character become better or worse? Well, if removing it would make them less, would weaken them as a character, then it probably isn't a flaw. It's probably a defining strength. Here are some characteristics of compelling, story-worthy flaws. One is if it's something the character doesn't see about themselves, but it seems to be causing damage to those around them. If it causes real damage or limits their ability to grow, that's one way that we know that it's a flaw. If it gets in the way of their ability to get love or purpose or redemption. If it's something that's rooted in fear or pride or shame or a false belief that needs to be corrected. If it creates internal tension that mirrors the external plot, like think Tony Stark's narcissism. It isolates him from real, genuine connection. Or Elsa's fear of her powers. That causes a lot of collateral damage and alienation. Or Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice. It nearly costs her love and happiness because she can't get over her prejudice. These are flaws that must be confronted in order for the character to step into their fullness. But here's what's not a flaw. Honesty is not a flaw. Loyalty is not a flaw. Intensity is not a flaw. Conviction is not a flaw. Courage is not a flaw. Now, these things may create tension. They may create friction. They may make other people or characters uncomfortable. But discomfort is not corruption. For example, let's look at Samwise Gamgee from The Lord of the Rings. Sam is loyal almost to a fault, and his loyalty puts him in danger. It causes real suffering, and yet it's not something he needs to cure. It's what makes him beautiful and heroic. The same is true with Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. His conviction isolates him from his community. But the story is not about Atticus learning to compromise or to see race differently. The story is about exposing the injustice of the world around him. And that's a major craft insight. Again, sometimes the world is the problem. And one of the biggest mistakes that writers make is assuming the protagonist must always change, when sometimes the story isn't about fixing the hero, it's about revealing the corruption of the world that opposes that hero. And then it's about showing them persevere in the face of their suffering because it's the right thing to do. And that kind of story can be powerful. And by the way, if you're asking yourself why any of this matters, the first reason is because getting it wrong will hurt your arc. But the second reason, perhaps even the more important reason, is because stories are not neutral. They teach people what is good, what is right, what is noble, what to value in this world. If every protagonist must be morally compromised in order to be seen as interesting, what are we actually teaching the audience? That virtue is naive, that conviction is immature, that integrity is stupid, that strength must be dismantled. But that's not depth. That's just cynicism masquerading as sophistication. And writers absorb it without realizing it. So my challenge to you is to learn to let traits be traits. Recognize that not every trait needs to be healed. Not every edge needs sanding down. The goal isn't to make your characters more palatable. It's to make them real. It's not necessarily to fix them. It's to reveal them and to let them then step into the person they were always meant to become. I once had a writer tell me that her protagonist's flaw was that she cares too much. So I asked her, does that cause harm or does it just make other people uncomfortable? And she said, well, it keeps hurting my protagonist. My protagonist keeps getting hurt. So I asked her, so you're saying the solution is to make her care less about people? Because the answer to that question is obvious. No, the solution is never to make your character harder or to make them less vulnerable or to make them care less about other people. That is never our goal in life or in story. Because what shows growth is an ability to be even more vulnerable at the risk of being hurt. So the solution for this character was to make her strong in her vulnerability. In other words, she chooses to take the risk to be vulnerable, even though she knows she might get hurt. That's strength, but it's the right thing to do. And she's not doing it because she's naive. She's doing it because she's strong. And sometimes we want a character to hold those lines, even when it costs them. Bosch doesn't need to compromise, he needs to persevere. The tension between who he is and what the world demands is exactly the point. Okay, now, just because a trait causes trouble doesn't mean it's a flaw to be fixed. Sometimes it's the very thing that makes a character heroic. And if modern storytelling keeps confusing virtue with weakness, we're not just going to weaken our characters. We'll weaken the kinds of heroes our culture is capable of even imagining. Because not every quirk is a flaw. And sometimes the real arc of the story is to learn to stand firm in the very trait that the world told you to abandon. So the next time someone asks what your protagonist's fatal flaw is, make sure it's actually a flaw. So now I'm curious, can you think of a character whose defining trait isn't a flaw that needs to be fixed, but the very thing that makes them heroic in that story? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening to The Storyteller's Mission with Zena Del Lowe. May you go forth inspired to change the world for the better through story.